Hello YouTube, Sidekick here in a T6 Texan, or should I say Harvard, at a little airfield in Medicine Hat, Alberta, in Canada. And why, you might ask, am I in Medicine Hat in this particular aircraft? Well, it's because I want to talk a little bit about aviation history, and Canadian aviation history in particular. I want to talk about a time when the airfield in Medicine Hat would have been alive with the sound of that Pratt & Whitney Wasp engine, a time when Canada was known as the aerodrome of democracy. In the early days of the Second World War, when it was becoming clear that the Royal Air Force was going to have to train an awful lot of aircrew, pilots and flight engineers and navigators, and it was also becoming clear that Britain was not going to be an ideal place to conduct that training, partly because there were just very few safe airspaces where novice flyers could learn without the threat of enemy activity, but also because there just weren't enough airfields or instructors or even places for the aircrew to live. But space and room to add more facilities was one thing that Canada had. In fact, Canada had an awful lot of it. And so a plan was hatched to send new aircrew from Britain and all across the British Empire to be trained in the wide open Canadian skies. From a modest beginning, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan would go on to train over 150,000 aircrew and build more than 8,000 buildings, including 700 hangars, at airfields in every corner of Canada. The airfields were mostly in small towns, where there was ample access to otherwise empty airspace. And so towns all across the country ended up with airfields they would not have otherwise had. Of those airfields became famous, like Malton, where the Avro Aero was developed and which is now the site of Toronto Pearson International Airport. Or like Abbotsford, that still hosts an international air show every year. Or like Saint-Hubert, which eventually became the home of the Canadian Space Agency. Others were spread far and wide across the landscape in places that most people have never heard of. Places like Moose Jaw, Swift Current, Vulcan, North Battleford, Portage la Prairie, and Medicine Hat. Many, like Medicine Hat, were on the Canadian prairies, wide and open, warm in summer, cold in winter, and dry all year round. An excellent place to learn how to fly. I should know, because it's where I learned. You see, I grew up in Medicine Hat in the 1970s and 80s. I was a proud member of No. 15 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Cadets. Our motto, like the motto of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Air Force, was Per Ardua ad Astra, through hard work to the stars. My weekly Air Cadet training took place in a building that had originally been part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan base at Medicine Hat. In fact, we just taxied by the building. It was off to the right, across the road behind the line of hangars. Now, those are new hangars, but when I was an Air Cadet, they were still the old BCAT hangars, although they were the bus barns for the local transit authority at the time. Through Air Cadets, I eventually learned how to fly. Not in Medicine Hat, but at another ex-BCAT airfield, Penhold, near the almost as poetically named Red Deer, Alberta. So I've always felt that I was very much flying in the footsteps of those young men who came from all over the empire to live and work and learn on the prairies during wartime. I've often wondered what they must have thought, especially those from the warmer or more urban parts of the empire. Housed in drafty barracks in the middle of the prairie, in the middle of an Alberta winter, where temperatures as low as -40 are not at all uncommon. In an area of the world where, well, cattle may not have outnumbered people at the time, but you probably would have had to do a count to be sure. Don't get me wrong, I liked growing up in Medicine Hat. It's not for nothing that it is an area of the world known as Big Sky Country, and believe me, it was a great place to learn how to fly. But it must have been a bit of a shock to a lad from London, or even Toronto, to end up here. Medicine Hat was the site of No. 34 Service Flying Training School, which of course meant that the students flew the ubiquitous Harvard, which was known in the U.S. as the AT-6 Texan, and which Microsoft Flight Simulator has now released as part of the Reno Air Race expansion. Now, unfortunately, there's no livery for the AT-6 in the famous training yellow and black of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, but for that part, we'll just have to pretend. So, here we are, lined up on the runway, as so many of those students would have been in those days, running up the engine and making those final checks before we take our Harvard off into the blue. For many of those students arriving here from their elementary flying training, the Harvard would have been a bit of a shock. Compared to the planes they had learned on, it was quite a step up in terms of weight and power, and it was also notoriously difficult to handle on the ground, which maybe you've been noticing a little bit as I was taxiing out. But it was felt to be a great trainer because it prepared pilots to fly the aircraft like the Spitfire and the Thunderbolt and the Mustang. And so pilots would have spent 16 weeks here in Medicine Hat learning how to fly the Harvard, and maybe taking off on a solo training flight to go practice a few things, just like we are here today. Now, the town would have been a lot smaller in those days. In fact, it's quite a bit bigger in Microsoft Flight Simulator than it was in the days when I lived there, even 30 years ago. But the basic terrain is the same. The landscape is dominated by the long, sinuous ribbon of the South Saskatchewan River that snakes through the prairie between steep-sided bluffs. Now, the town of Medicine Hat sits in a leafy valley in a spot where the distance between the bluffs widens out to a few kilometers. For this reason, it was chosen by the surveyors of the Canadian National Railway to be the site where the railway crossed the river, since it meant that they could build a relatively low bridge over the river at this point. Later, Medicine Hat would be chosen to be on the route of the Trans-Canada Highway that passes through from the east and turns northwest to run towards Calgary. That's it there. About 50 kilometers along that road is Canadian Forces Base Suffield, on the western edge of the Suffield training area. The river, which turns north after leaving Medicine Hat to the east, forms the eastern edge of the 2,700 square kilometer training block. Now, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that this would have been the area where a lot of student training took place during the Second World War. Now, I'm not actually sure what the curriculum of a service flying training school would have been. By the time the students arrived here, they would have been through the initial training school, which involved no flight training, but was a combination of ground school and final selection process, with candidates that weren't judged fit for pilot training being rerouted to the wireless air gunner stream. After ITS, it was off to one of the elementary flying training schools, perhaps just down the road at Lethbridge. Here, they would have gotten their first 50 hours of basic flying instruction on a Tiger Moth, or its equivalent. So once the candidates arrived in Medicine Hat, they would have been a little bit less than halfway through their 6 months in Canada. The candidates who reported here would have been part of the fighter pilot stream, and would have been destined to fly RAF Spitfires or Hurricanes, Typhoons, or Tempests in the skies over Europe. Once they completed their training here, they probably would have been off to an operational training unit. And a few short weeks after leaving the friendly skies of southern Alberta, they would likely have had their first taste of combat. I'm sure that a lot of their time would have been spent with their instructors learning their craft. I'm also sure that they would have gotten some time to fly solo. So what would they have done when they were out there alone in their Harvard over the wide prairie on a cold December day? Well, maybe they would have warmed up by just practicing some nice tight turns, getting a feeling for the aircraft, listening to the creaks and groans and learning to understand what the airplane was doing by feeling it and hearing it. Who knows, maybe they were even practicing some aerobatics, like an Immelman. Now, obviously, that would have gone much faster in, for instance, a Spitfire, but it's not a maneuver they would have been able to accomplish probably in a Tiger Moth. Perhaps they would have tried some other moves, like maybe a split S. And of course, once they got down a little bit closer to the ground, maybe they would be thinking about practicing some actual ground attack techniques, like a wingover. Of course, they would have been taught, like we always talk about, to pull that lift vector towards the target, roll the nose out towards the target, and dive in. Now, the thing I wonder, though, about the pilots that flew out of Medicine Hat, I'm sure that flying down the river valley at low level would have been an activity that was absolutely 100% strictly forbidden. But, you know, when you see it lying there, that twisting snake, that ribbon through the bluffs, you just got to wonder whether or not there weren't some pilots that didn't resist the temptation to go for a little joyride down the river. So maybe that's what we'll do. Just take a little flight down the river. The South Saskatchewan River, like a lot of prairie rivers, is cut between some fairly steep bluffs. It's true to say on the prairies that most of the relief is down rather than up like it is in more hilly or mountainous terrain. The most extreme example of this would, of course, be the Colorado River and things like the Grand Canyon. Because the prairies are very flat, the rivers also tend to meander a lot with wide curves and even oxbow lakes. And then, periodically there are places like the valley that contains Medicine Hat where the bluffs are farther apart and the river meanders back and forth between them. And that's kind of the region that we're in now. We're negotiating the last few turns before we actually come into town. Now, obviously, even if there were some students that decided to take a bit of a low-level flight along the river, they probably would not have been stupid enough to do it this close to town, where they clearly would have been seen by somebody. They probably would have done it out in the middle of the training area, away from prying eyes. So we are coming into the last couple of turns here before we come into Medicine Hat. In fact, the bluffs that are just appearing now on the left-hand side, those high bluffs, are actually the ones that I would have seen out of the front window of the house I lived in when I lived in Medicine Hat as a teenager. The city at that time had about 40,000 inhabitants. Now it's up to about 65,000 and spreads out in either direction away from the valley along the river to the north and to the south. Medicine Hat has always been kind of famous for the natural gas reserves that are actually found underneath the city. In fact, Rudyard Kipling referred to it as the city with all hell for a basement at one point. During the Second World War, it was not only the home of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan Base, it was actually the home of a POW camp for German prisoners of war. Today, Medicine Hat is kind of the picture of a modern, small Canadian prairie city serving the agricultural area, primarily ranching around it, and also with some industries based on the oil and gas industry, like the Goodyear rubber plant north of town. But certainly one of the signature features of the town has always been the river and the bluffs. Periodically, the river has actually flooded out the lower part of town in particularly extreme years, the last of which was more than 20 years ago now, though. And so here we are making the final turn into town. On the right is an area of town known as Police Point Park, which is full of old cottonwood trees, which are endemic to the Canadian prairies and is a site you should see if you ever get a chance to go there. We're going to make one last turn into town, and we're going to see that there are some bridges confronting us. And, well, Microsoft Flight Simulator, you don't try to fly under bridges. So we're going to get ourselves straightened out here and pop up. And we're going to find out something that I'm sure none of the students at the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan ever learned, because they never would have done this. But if you pop up right over the bridge, you end up almost on final for the runway. So we're just going to straighten ourselves out here and try to get ourselves set up for landing on the runway. And one of the things I have learned about the Harvard or Texan is that it actually holds its speed pretty well on final, even with flaps and gear down. Hopefully we can get it down. I'm still learning how to land this aircraft, so let me concentrate on trying to get myself set up here for a sec. Self lined up, power back. here and flaps down. We might even be a little bit high. I'm sure our Commonwealth air training instructors would not be pleased with this approach, but they probably wouldn't be pleased with us for how we got here either, so we'll just have to not worry about that. Yeah, we're going to be a little high. We'll see if we can kill off a little bit more of this speed, but it's okay. Not going to be a great landing, but I'm sure we can get it on the ground. Got a nice long runway there. So, while I try to get myself down before the end of the runway, just let me say that I hope you've enjoyed this little tribute to the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, the thing that made Canada the aerodrome of democracy, to the town of Medicine Hat that hosted one of those facilities, and to the young men that flew there, many of them who probably ended up in combat, and many of them who probably did not live to see the end of the war. Glad that Microsoft Flight Simulator has given me a chance to put this little video together. I hope you enjoy it. If you're enjoying these videos, please like the videos and subscribe to the channel, and stick around here for a couple more minutes and maybe we'll have some live drone footage of what Medicine Hat looks like today. Thanks for watching, and I think it's about time for me to say this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.